She was born in a palace overlooking the Bosphorus. Her grandfather was the last Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Her other grandfather was the last Caliph of Islam. Her name was the final entry ever written into the imperial registry of the House of Osman, a 600-year-old dynasty that closed its book forever right after her birth. She never knew an ordinary day, not until she turned 3 years old. Stripped of her citizenship, stripped of her palace, stripped of the right to ever set foot in her own homeland again. That should have been the end of her story. A single tragedy, like so many others. But 20 years later, fate handed her a second crown, in Egypt. She married a prince. Her husband became the single most powerful man standing behind the Egyptian throne. And then, in the span of a few violent days in 1952, history did something almost impossible to believe. It repeated itself. The same woman, watching a second empire collapse beneath her feet. This is one of the strangest, cruelest coincidences in modern royal history, and almost nobody has ever told it. So let's go back to the beginning, to a palace on the Bosphorus in the winter of 1921, and find out exactly what happened to the only woman in the 20th century who lost 2 crowns. On the 4th of February 1921, a girl was born into a world that was already dying, even if nobody inside the palace walls wanted to admit it yet. Her name was Neslişah Sultan, and her bloodline was almost impossibly rare. Her mother, Neslişah Sultan, was the daughter of Mehmed VI, the 36th and final Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Her father, Ömer Faruk Efendi, was the son of Abdülmecid II, the man who would become the very last Caliph of Islam. 2 dying titles, 1 infant girl. She carried the entire weight of 6 centuries in her name before she could even walk. For the first 3 years of her life, Neslişah lived the only existence she would ever know as a birthright. Absolute, unquestioned imperial privilege. Marble floors, silk curtains, servants who had spent their whole lives learning how to anticipate the needs of children they would never be permitted to raise as their own. She was rocked to sleep within sight of the same waters that Ottoman fleets had once commanded across 3 continents. She did not know it yet, but she was already the last of something. Her name would be the final entry ever inscribed in the official Ottoman dynastic registry, the Şehzade Osmani, before the book itself was closed and the institution that maintained it ceased to exist. Then came the 3rd of March, 1924. The Grand National Assembly in Ankara did not debate for long. In a single session, the deputies voted to abolish the Caliphate entirely, strip the Ottoman dynasty of Turkish citizenship, confiscate every palace and every possession, and expel the entire family from the country within days. Not months, days. 156 people were named on the list. Neslişah, not yet 3 years old, was one of them. There was no time to grieve the loss properly, because there was no time at all. Trains were boarded before dawn, palaces were abandoned mid-sentence, drawers still full, portraits still hanging on the walls. Her family, along with dozens of others who had never worked a single day in their lives, were handed a small sum of Turkish currency and told, in effect, leave and do not come back. Nobody in the family believed it was permanent. That was the cruelest detail of all. They packed as if for a short trip. Neslişah Sultan reportedly left behind jewellery, clothing and personal effects she assumed she would return for within the year. She never saw any of it again. The family settled, like so many other exiled Ottomans, on the French Riviera. Nice became something close to a shadow capital for a scattered dynasty with nowhere else to go. And it was there, in rented villas and modest apartments, that a toddler who had been born to command an empire learned instead what it meant to be stateless. No valid passport, no legal right to work, no nation willing to call her a citizen. She grew up fluent in loss before she was fluent in anything else. This is the detail that makes Neslişah's story different from almost every other Ottoman exile. For most of the 156, this was where the tragedy ended. Decades of quiet poverty, forgotten titles, dishes washed in hotel kitchens, jewellery sold for a fraction of its worth just to survive another winter. Picture the scale of what was actually lost. This was not a family accustomed to modest comfort suddenly tightening its belt. This was a family that, weeks earlier, had servants assigned to individual tasks as specific as tying a single sash correctly. Neslişah Sultan, Neslişah's mother, had been raised inside a system where money was never touched, never counted, never even discussed in front of her. Now she was expected to manage a household budget in a foreign currency, in a rented apartment with no training and no safety net beneath her. The Turkish government did not simply exile the family and move on. Officials in Ankara continued monitoring the dynasty's movements abroad for years afterward, treating even routine family events, a marriage, a christening, a private gathering as matters of political concern. The message was unmistakable. This was not merely banishment. It was an attempt to erase the House of Osman from the world's memory entirely, one generation at a time. For Neslişah, this was only the first act. By the time Neslişah reached adulthood, she had spent nearly 2 decades learning how to survive without a crown. She had watched her parents navigate poverty with the stiff, practiced dignity of people who had once ruled a quarter of the known world. She had grown up among cousins and relatives who whispered constantly about Istanbul, about palaces now turned into museums, about a homeland none of them were legally allowed to enter. And then, in 1940, something extraordinary happened. Something that no exiled Ottoman family member could have reasonably expected. Neslişah married into royalty again. Her husband was Prince Abdel Moneim, a member of Egypt's ruling Muhammad Ali dynasty, the son of Abbas Hilmi II, the very last Khedive of Egypt before the British restructured the country's monarchy during the First World War. Abdel Moneim was not merely a minor royal cousin. He was, by seniority and bloodline, one of the most significant men standing near the Egyptian throne. For a moment it must have felt like a correction, like the universe was quietly repaying a debt. A girl who had lost an empire at 3 years old was now, at 19, standing inside a royal court once again. This time in Cairo, under the Egyptian sun, married to a man whose family controlled the Suez Canal zone's political orbit, and whose name appeared just beneath the kings in matters of state. Egypt in the 1940s was a monarchy balanced on a knife's edge. King Farouk, I sat on the throne, a young ruler whose early promise had curdled into a reputation for extravagance, corruption, and an almost theatrical disconnect from the poverty surrounding his palaces. British troops still occupied the Suez Canal zone under a treaty that infuriated Egyptian nationalists. A generation of young military officers was quietly, patiently watching the monarchy rot from the inside. Neslişah did not step into a stable court. She stepped into a kingdom already living on borrowed time, though almost nobody around her wanted to say so out loud. Abdel Moneim, meanwhile, occupied a strange and precarious position of his own. He was royal, respected, and widely seen as a figure of genuine dignity in a court increasingly defined by scandal. He was, by many accounts, one of the few senior royals whom even critics of the monarchy did not despise. That reputation would matter enormously, very soon, in ways neither he nor Neslişah could have predicted. For 12 years, Neslişah lived as an Egyptian princess. She raised her family within the same rhythms of royal life she had once lost in Istanbul. Court protocol, formal receptions, existence built around obligation and appearance. If there was ever a moment where she allowed herself to believe the worst chapter of her life was permanently behind her, this would have been it. There is something almost unbearably poignant in the small details of this period. Neslişah reportedly kept fragments of Ottoman court etiquette alive inside an entirely different royal household. Small rituals of formality, ways of receiving guests, ways of addressing elders, that had nothing to do with Egyptian tradition and everything to do with a childhood she barely remembered living, yet somehow still carried inside her. She was in effect quietly preserving a dead empire's customs inside the walls of a living one, without anyone around her fully realizing what she was doing. Cairo in those years was a city of extraordinary contrasts. Grand hotels along the Nile hosted European aristocrats, fleeing a continent still recovering from war, while just beyond the palace gates, poverty and political frustration were reaching a boiling point that the royal court seemed almost willfully unable to see. Farouk's court had become, in the eyes of many ordinary Egyptians, a symbol of everything wrong with the old order: lavish, foreign-influenced, and increasingly detached from the nation it claimed to rule. Neslişah once again found herself living inside a system whose foundations were quietly cracking beneath the marble. It was an illusion, and it was about to be shattered in the exact same way it had been shattered once before. On the night of the 22nd of July 1952, a group of Egyptian army officers calling themselves the Free Officers Movement seized key military and communication installations across Cairo. Their leader, publicly at least, was General Muhammad Naguib. Their true architect, working carefully from the shadows, was a young lieutenant colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser. By the morning of July 23rd, the coup was complete. King Farouk, the man who had once been celebrated as Egypt's great modernizing hope, was now a prisoner in his own palace in Alexandria. The free officers did not want a bloodbath. They wanted legitimacy. So on the 26th of July 1952, they gave Farouk a choice with only one real answer: abdicate or face something far worse. He signed the papers. He boarded the royal yacht Marusa, and by nightfall he was sailing into permanent exile, never to see Egypt again. But here is the detail almost nobody remembers, the detail that pulls Neslişah's story back into the center of Egyptian history at the exact moment it seemed to be someone else's tragedy. Farouk did not abdicate to end the monarchy. He abdicated in favor of his infant son, a 7-month-old baby named Ahmed Fuad, now technically King Fuad II of Egypt. An infant cannot rule a country in crisis. Egypt needed a regent, and the man the free officers selected to head that 3-man regency council, the man who would formally hold power on behalf of a baby who would never understand what he had briefly been, was Prince Abdel Moneim, Neslişah's husband. For 11 months, Neslişah Sultan stood at the absolute center of Egyptian power once again. Her husband presided, in name, over the government of a nation balanced between monarchy and revolution. She had gone from a 3-year-old stripped of an empire on a train platform in Istanbul to the wife of the acting head of state of Egypt. It was, by any measure, one of the most improbable trajectories in 20th century royal history. It did not last. The free officers had never intended the regency to be permanent. It was a bridge, not a destination. Nasser and his allies spent the following months systematically dismantling what remained of the old order. Land reforms that broke the power of the aristocratic estates, political purges that removed the monarchy's remaining allies, and a growing public narrative that painted the entire royal system, infant king included, as an outdated relic incompatible with the new Egypt. On the 18th of June 1953, the Egyptian Revolutionary Command Council made it official. The monarchy was abolished. Egypt was declared a republic. Farouk II, who had reigned for less than a year without ever understanding he had reigned at all, was formally deposed before his 2nd birthday. Muhammad Naguib became the first president of Egypt. The Regency Council, and with it Abdel Moneim's position at the summit of Egyptian power, simply ceased to exist. Neslişah Sultan had now watched 2 empires die in front of her. The first time, she had been too young to understand what was happening. The second time, she understood everything. Consider the strange, almost theatrical irony sitting at the heart of this moment. Abdel Moneim had spent nearly a year holding formal power on behalf of a baby who would never remember reigning at all. A boy king who was fed, bathed, and put to sleep by nursemaids while his regent signed decrees in his name. Fuad II's entire reign lasted approximately 11 months, and he was deposed before he ever spoke his first complete sentence. He remains to this day one of the youngest monarchs in modern history to be formally removed from a throne he never understood he held. For Neslişah, watching this unfold from inside the palace, the pattern must have felt almost hallucinatory. 30 years earlier, an infant relative of her own had similarly been swept up in the collapse of the Ottoman Sultanate, a 10-year-old prince accompanying the last sultan into exile on a British warship. Now history had produced an eerie mirror image: another child, another crown, another collapse, and once again her own family standing directly inside the wreckage. There is a particular kind of cruelty in losing something you already knew how to lose. When the Ottoman dynasty was expelled from Turkey in 1924, 3-year-old Neslişah had no context for what was happening to her. It was simply the only reality she had ever known, arriving without warning, incomprehensible in the way that all catastrophes are incomprehensible to a small child. In 1953, there was no such mercy. Neslişah was 32 years old. She understood, with total and devastating clarity, exactly what was slipping away, because she had lived through the exact same collapse once before, in a different language, in a different palace, on a different continent. The family that had once stood at the head of Egyptian political life was now, once again, a liability. Members of the deposed Egyptian royal family scattered across Europe in the aftermath of the Republic's declaration. Switzerland, Monaco, France, wherever old money and older titles could still open a door. Assets were frozen. Properties were nationalized. The systematic erasure that Neslişah had witnessed happen to the House of Osman in 1924 repeated itself, almost beat for beat, against the House of Muhammad Ali in 1953. She had grown up watching her own mother learn, out of brutal necessity, how to live without servants, without a fixed income, without the certainty that had defined every single day of her early childhood. Now Neslişah faced her own version of that same education, except this time she was the one who had to teach it to her own children. The habits die slowly. That is one of the most quietly devastating patterns among dethroned royalty across history, and Neslişah's family was no exception. Formal titles used at the dinner table long after those titles carried no legal meaning whatsoever. Old court etiquette observed in cramped, rented apartments. A strange and almost ceremonial insistence on doing things properly, even when properly no longer meant anything to the outside world. It is not vanity. It is the only architecture some people have left to hold themselves together. Jewelry was sold, piece by piece, the way it had been sold by Ottoman exiles 30 years earlier, often for far less than its true value, to buyers who understood exactly how desperate the seller had become. Properties that had once belonged to two separate royal houses, Ottoman and Egyptian, were reduced to auction listings and government inventories. The woman who had once been positioned, however briefly, at the summit of two nations, was now negotiating the practical logistics of statelessness for the second time in her life. And yet, there is a detail in Neslişah's story that separates her from almost every other double exile in modern history: timing. In 1952, the very same year her husband's regency in Egypt was collapsing, the Turkish government finally relaxed its decades-old exile law for female members of the former Ottoman dynasty. After 28 years, women of the House of Osman were permitted to return to Turkey. Neslişah, in other words, was losing her second crown in Cairo, at almost the exact moment the door to her first long-lost homeland finally cracked open. It is difficult to imagine the emotional whiplash of that convergence. One empire's collapse closing around her in Egypt. Another nation's decades-long door slammed shut on a 3-year-old in 1924, finally creaking open in Turkey. Loss and return, arriving almost simultaneously in two different countries tied to two different thrones. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from having to rebuild an identity twice in one lifetime, using entirely different materials each time. The first collapse had stripped Neslişah of a Turkish identity she was too young to have fully formed. The second collapse stripped her of an Egyptian identity. She had spent 12 deliberate years constructing friendships, routines, a household, a place in a court she had come to understand intimately. Losing something you never really had is one kind of grief. Losing something you built with your own hands at 32 years old, watching it dismantled piece by men you had once hosted at your own dinner table, is another kind entirely. Some members of the extended Egyptian royal family fared far worse than Neslişah and Abdel Moneim in the years that followed the Republic's declaration. Properties were nationalized outright. Bank accounts were frozen without warning. A handful of former courtiers, stripped overnight of both income and legal protection, quietly slipped into poverty in cities that had once rolled out red carpets for their arrival. The pattern from Istanbul in 1924 repeated itself in Cairo in 1953 with almost mechanical precision. The same confiscations, the same sudden statelessness, the same disbelief among people who had never imagined their names could simply be crossed off a registry. Neslişah eventually made her way back to the country she had been forced to leave as a toddler, a homeland she had only ever known through her mother's stories, through faded photographs, through the particular grief of people who describe a place they cannot legally visit. Istanbul, when she finally saw it, was nothing like the empire she had been born into. The palaces where her grandfather had once ruled as Sultan, where her other grandfather had once held the title of Caliph over the entire Sunni Muslim world, were now museums, government buildings, tourist attractions with ticket booths at the gates. The city itself had spent 3 decades defining its modern identity in deliberate opposition to everything her family had once represented. She rebuilt a life there, eventually, alongside the quieter, more private work of preserving what remained of her family's history. A history that Turkish schools had spent 2 generations teaching as a cautionary tale of imperial excess and decline, rather than the lived experience of actual people who were still, in fact, alive. Neslişah Sultan died in Istanbul on the 2nd of April 2012, at the age of 91. She was, by that point, the last living person whose birth had ever been formally recorded in the imperial registry of the Ottoman dynasty, a document that had been permanently closed the same year she nearly didn't survive her earliest exile as a toddler on a departing train. Think for a moment about what that single life actually contained. Born into an empire that had ruled for 6 centuries, exiled from it before she could form a memory of it, married into a second empire on a different continent, built by a different dynasty, present at the literal centre of power when that second empire also collapsed. And finally, after nearly 3 decades of statelessness, permitted to die peacefully in the one city that had cast her out as an infant. No other figure in 20th century royal history experienced quite this specific pattern of loss. Members of the Romanov dynasty were executed outright. Members of the Habsburg dynasty lost their empire, but largely retained their wealth and social standing across Europe. Even most other exiled Ottoman royals experienced only a single collapse, however devastating. Neslişah Sultan experienced 2, Ottoman and Egyptian, Sultan and regent's wife. A childhood ended by one revolution, an adulthood upended by another, and yet by most accounts she did not spend her final decades defined by bitterness. She became something closer to a living archive, a woman who had personally witnessed the last gasp of 2 ruling houses that between them had once governed tens of millions of people across 3 continents. Historians and documentary filmmakers sought her out in her later years, aware that when she died, an entire category of first-hand memory would die with her. She gave interviews. She helped preserve family records. She walked, on at least one recorded occasion, back through the halls of a palace her family had once been dragged out of by force, decades earlier, this time as an invited guest rather than a fleeing exile. Her story is not simply a historical curiosity. It is a rare, almost unbearably precise window into how the entire structure of monarchy across the Middle East and the Mediterranean was dismantled across the 20th century, not in one clean historical moment, but in a long, overlapping series of collapses, each one connected to the next by the same families, the same bloodlines, sometimes even the same individual human beings, forced to watch it happen not once, but twice. The age of monarchy across the Middle East did not end quietly, and it did not end all at once. It ended family by family, palace by palace, decade after decade, in a slow and often brutal unravelling that stretched from Istanbul to Cairo to capitals. Most people have never even connected to this story. Neslişah Sultan carried the weight of that entire unravelling inside a single lifetime. 2 crowns, 2 collapses, 2 exiles. One woman, standing at the exact centre of 2 of the most consequential political earthquakes of the modern Middle East, both times not by ambition, but simply by birth and by marriage. Her story raises a question that history rarely answers cleanly. Was she a victim of forces entirely beyond her control, twice punished for the mere accident of her bloodline? Or was there something almost inevitable about a life built so close to power in an era when so much power was about to fall? I want to know what you think. One word. Just one word in the comments below. Was Neslişah's story a tragedy, or was it simply history doing what history has always done to families who stand too close to a crown? If this story pulled you in the way it pulled me in, there are more of these buried in the historical record. Entire dynasties, entire lifetimes, quietly waiting to be told properly. Subscribe, and I'll keep finding them for you.